Hi everyone and welcome to our fourth lecture. This lecture is all focused around different potential barriers, and this lecture along with following lectures will each tackle different potential barriers. So this one is all focused on culture, and just a warning that in the slides to follow there are some pictures of some of our First Nations people, and just to warn you that they will be coming up in subsequent slides. So when we're thinking about what we're going to encounter in terms of culture in our classrooms and in our schools, we want to think about these particular things. We want to look at what could be the potential barriers and how are we going to make sure that we are truly valuing cultural diversity and Aboriginal and First Nations culture, and making sure that we have a good understanding and we're looking at it through today's context, and we're not continuing to perpetuate stereotypes or older ways of thinking that may be still operating in a lot of our schools. So who are our families that we find difficult to reach and to connect with? So we looked last week a little bit about different types of families and how they can interact with us differently and so on. This one is focused very much on culture. Next week we're looking a lot at family structure and economics, and potentially some things to do with abuse and things as well. And so we want to make sure that we are understanding how, when and why we're going to approach each type of family. So we've looked at different family structures. Now let's look at particularly focused on the idea of culture. So when we think about barriers, what we're looking at is what are the potential barriers, and therefore how do we remove them? How do we make sure that we don't put artificial fences between us and our families that we are working with directly in our classrooms and within our wider communities as well, depending on the type of school that you're at. So if we look at how culture is defined, so it's looking at the ever-changing values, traditions, social and political relationships, and the worldview created and shared by a group of people. So culture is not something that is written down and said, this is what everyone must follow. It's that idea of its ever-changing values. So the way that I was educated and grown up, the culture that we talked about and so on, was quite significantly different to the culture that we're seeing in schools now. So we need to be aware that it is constantly changing. And cultural differences can lead literally to wars. So we need to be really aware of avoiding misunderstandings and miscommunications between us, our families, our teachers, our leaders, and so on. So when you have a look at your text in a little bit more detail, there are 6 major components of culture. So we're looking at the values and behavioural styles. So that's what you hold dear, and then the way that you act and implement those. The language and the dialects, so that could be literally the language that you speak, but often even the slang that we use here in WA compared to over in the East, or things that we talk about in Australia compared to other countries around the world. It's our non-verbal communication. So you know that in your family, you might have certain looks that can pass between you, and you're like, yeah, I know exactly what that means. When you're in a staff room, there'll be certain looks that will be between you and your best buddy that you're teaching with that you know will be part of that non-verbal communication. And the same thing happens when we're working with our community members. They will have looks between them if they're not pleased, or if they are really pleased with what's going on. The cultural cognition, so that is the understanding of what makes up that culture and everybody's perceptions of it. And then moving on to our perspectives, our worldviews, and what we term as our frames of reference. So what we believe, where we think those beliefs come from, and so on. And finally, how we identify. So it's not talking about our physical status. It's not talking about the color of our hair or the color of our skin or the color of our eyes. It's talking about what we identify with. None of those in culture talk about the way we look. And that's often what we refer to when we talk about culture. So we need to be aware of the differences between appearance versus culture. And when we look at the way that Early Childhood Australia understands it, it says that culture is learned in the families and communities. It's about belonging to groups of people and being a shared way of doing, believing, and knowing. So it's about that idea of, in your community, these are the things we do, these are our shared values, this is our way of doing things, that's our culture. And it's saying that everyone has a culture, but that culture is dynamic, meaning it potentially changes, and it should be changing. And it influences the way that we go about meeting our material and non-material needs. And that last element, that language is a vital element of culture. So language being the language that you speak, but also the non-verbals together with the verbal communication and the nuances of that verbal communication. So we might all be speaking English, but we're saying it in different ways sometimes. So helping teachers and educators to recognise that our cultural differences and family cultural differences, they are going to have a very marked impact on the way that we communicate with our communities and the relationships that we start to form, and how we potentially can create great partnerships, or how we could inadvertently damage things. So understanding the differences means that we don't have to be different, we just have to understand the differences. So we all experience those times when we have been labelled, or we unexpectedly label someone else. We have potentially expectations placed on us because of something, or we're assigned identities that we don't or may not accept. So our culture can be in contradiction to those labels that we have been assigned. So that's why it's important for us to understand that culture is not anything to do with the way you look or the family. It's all to do with your beliefs and the way that you were raised and the things that you believe are important and so on. It's not because you are insert nationality. It's a lot more than just the simplistic view that way. So cultural diversity, it's not about having one day in the year that's Harmony Day. It's about making sure that we respect the ways that every culture can create and be positive to all of our society. So when we devalue a culture or a set of cultures and unintentionally possibly overvalue other cultures, we create this power dominance, and it means that we don't equally value all cultures. Now in Australia we have that, I think it's quite unique that we have so many cultures within Australia. However, I don't believe that they are equal, and that we still have lots of inequalities that need to be resolved when we're looking at our national identity and how, down to a granular level at a school, we work with other people. So if we think about culture, we've got these two key ideas that we look at. Enculturated, that's the process of moving deeply into accepting someone for the beliefs, practices, and lifestyle norms of that culture. So you're raised in that culture and you learn in it, and you are enculturated. Acculturation is when you move between two cultures. So for example, you immigrate, you are being invaded in some way. You've got a changing of your culture to be a blend of two. It could be termed that assimilation of culture, but it can also result in a bicultural identity. So you can explore that a little bit more on around page 108 or so of the text. And that's where we can sometimes get issues that start to happen because children are trying to fit in, and parents sometimes are trying to fit in, or the children are trying to fit in, but the parents are wanting to stay in their culture, and the children are coming to school that has a different culture, and the two aren't melding. And it can be really tricky for some children, especially if we don't understand what they're going through about it. So let's have a look at our cultural factors and our families. So our cultural factors and families are where we've created those non-physical characteristics that distinguish societies and groups, and so on. Our physical characteristics, they're things like our language, our cultural factors that identify and distinguish them from mainstream. Then if we look at the idea that until the 1970s, we basically operated most schools from a really mainstream Anglo culture. That just was the way it happened. That's the way I was educated. It would have been the way most of your parents were educated. People came into Australia and into schools, and it's almost like they were expected to be Australian. And Australian didn't mean a multicultural Australia as much. It meant very white Australian. And we did certain things, we acted certain ways, and everyone was supposed to fit in. That has now, and should do, changed. So what we started to develop then was this idea of cultural pluralism, meaning that we wanted to have many cultures and to meld them together, not to have one better than the other. Now, what this means is that we emphasize this idea of a multicultural curriculum and multi-ethnic relations. So when we walk into a school, we should see a diversity of people working in the school, a diversity of people attending the school, a diversity of people who are participating within our school. So we will see, hear, and feel different cultures and the way they are operating. It's not about only the physical part of seeing children who look different, but that is certainly part of what you will start to see in schools now. But it's about that culture that is all those almost unwritten things that are going on in families and cultures. So, different cultural things that you will encounter. So, I was out at a school earlier in the week, and there was a little girl and her little sister had both come out from, I think it was Bhutan, and I'm not really sure where Bhutan is. However, she's come into the school with minimal English, but it's fascinating to watch the other year twos interact so positively with her. There is another little boy who's come into the school as well, and he's in year 4. And so what the school did was they pushed out onto all the year 4 iPads the Translate app, and he and his classmates are happily translating between so that he's able to communicate his needs effectively, as well as they were telling jokes and being very silly about lots of things as well with it, and giggling and laughing. So we want to make sure that we are really allowing it to happen, and that we recognize and celebrate that people have different ways of knowing, being, and so on. And that could also include different cognitive styles. It could also make sure that we are supporting them with different languages and different language backgrounds. Now, it is quite difficult, especially when language is a barrier. When I was in one of those classrooms with the little boy in year 4, so we were talking about his Apple ID, and he had brought along his iPad, but it was still signed in with mum and dad's Apple ID, and the school uses what's called managed Apple IDs. And so we had put into the Translate app that he needed to ask mum to sign out of the current Apple ID that was on there. And then about 5 minutes later, he came up with his iPad, he'd FaceTimed mum. And he'd misinterpreted that we meant later on in the afternoon, and the language meant that he had called mum at that instant. Luckily, mum does speak English, so the teacher could talk to her about it. But we have to appreciate the different language differences that we will encounter, and that we as educators have to make sure that we are really showing the children that we want them to succeed, that we are positive about them, we embrace their abilities, and that we want them to do well at school. Because what we know is that family and culture will influence children's intellectual development. We know there is nature versus nurture. So, children's intelligence is influenced by the kind of family and community in which they grow up. So some of you would have grown up in families where going to school, staying at school, going on to university, and achieving certain academic goals is paramount. others may have gone through a family and a culture that it wasn't as valued. And so knowing that different families have different ideas about education is important. So some factors about our cultural beliefs and our ceremonies, we sometimes contribute to those. Some schools really celebrate academic achievement. Some schools really celebrate sporting achievement. Some schools have a good celebration of both. So think, what does your school celebrate? And is that going to be a positive experience for all families within your school if they only celebrate academic achievement, or the majority is sporting achievements? How do we celebrate all of the other developments and all of the other great things that children and families can do? So we want to make sure that we get parents involved, especially if the parents have high aspirations and expectations, because that will really encourage their children. I know that I have worked with lots of different families where they have been immigrants into Australia from a variety of different countries, and education literally is the most important thing in their lives for their children. They scrimp and they save to send their children to the best schools that they can afford, and they have expectations for their children and expectation for their educators that it will be a particular style of education, that you will give them extra homework, you will essentially sometimes punish them if they do the wrong thing, and they have very high expectations. And that is really challenging sometimes, because sometimes our schooling system doesn't align with those expectations. So we have to be very conscious of how, when, and why we're sharing information and so on. So what we need to make sure is that we are responding to the culture. We're being culturally responsive in our teaching. What that means is that we are making sure that we're affirming the culture of the students, we're helping them to understand their own culture, and we're helping them to really delve into the culture of others. So that means that we have to have open communication. It means the teachers have to have a really positive attitude towards diversity. We have to make sure as educators that we're not operating on falsehoods or stereotypes, that we need to understand what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, that we don't just dismiss when a child says, can you please not do that, or I'm not allowed to do that, or can you talk to my mum about that, and so on. We want to make sure that we're avoiding any of those bias, which unfortunately, if you don't do research, you potentially could just through ignorance.
I'm not sure I understand.
So you want to make sure that you are overcoming your own communication barriers and your own beliefs, and that you are educating yourself and others that you're working with about any of those cultural bias that you want to avoid in any way. When we look at our EYLF, so we have a cultural competence that we must meet. So educators who are culturally competent, we respect multiple cultural ways of knowing, seeing, living, and celebrate the benefits of that diversity. We're willing to understand the difference and to work for equality in opportunity. And we can't develop a strong sense of identity and belonging if our culture is ignored. So if our culture or a child's culture, apologies for the spelling error that I just spotted. So what is culturally responsive teaching? This is the beginning of it, but it's not the end. So this is just where we start. I don't like to see schools that don't celebrate culture apart from Harmony Day. And they make this big song and dance literally on Harmony Day. There should be a lead into it. It should be an authentic celebration of things, and then there should be continued efforts all the way through. So it shouldn't be just a one and done type of thing. We want to make sure that we have symbols and messages around the class. So it could be things in multiple languages represented in different ways. It could be that you have, when you are doing the morning greetings, you might do greetings in different languages of the children who are in the class. It might be that you are actively finding out more about different cultures that are within the classroom and in the school. You're making sure that you are stepping forward and organising awareness programs for the cultural groups that exist in your community, and making sure that you are helping them to contact each other so they can help one another and support one another, as well as making sure that you are authentically connecting with them as well. So we always want to be very reflective and think about what we're doing and why we are doing it. So making sure that we are not just playing a game and ticking a box and filling in a day somewhere, but we are authentically weaving it in. And children can spot that, parents can spot it, other educators can spot it as well. Make sure that you are very authentic about things. So when we want to work with families, we will ask for guidance, we'll make changes, and we'll ensure that we are really having that sense of inclusiveness. So we want to start that really good relationship with parents that is based on equality and respect. So exchanging information with parents about any cultural differences, asking. Parents would, or community members would rather you ask rather than do something that is contradicts you to their beliefs. Or say, oh, I'm sure this won't matter to you. Well, it might. So let's check first. So involve the parents in the school where they will then start to feel comfortable coming into the school. Set some mutual goals. So invite the parents in so that they can actually see what's going on. So think, what are you actually going to do so that every child and family will feel safe? So validate the home language so that way the caregivers know that their child will not be excluded because they might speak that language sometimes, or that they are not included in meetings because they don't speak the same language. And again, lots of schools do this so beautifully. They have things in multiple languages that go out. They have interpreters that they can access and so on. So don't let language be the barrier that you're inadvertently creating. So now we need to have a look at our First Nations. So let's look at what is the language we use and how do we make sure that we are saying and doing the right things to make sure that we are not perpetuating and using wrong definitions, wrong language, and upsetting people. Because I find that a lot of times, again, ignorance is not an excuse. We need to find out more. So there's a lot of different resources that are available. I've put a video up onto our Blackboard that explains kinship, for example, and that will help you when you have children of our First Nations people in your class, so that way you can understand when they talk about auntie and uncle and so on, that the definitions are different to the definitions that you may have. It's not that they are wrong, they're just defined differently. So we want to make sure that we are using the right terms in the right way. So, for example, terms that you will hear referred to are Aboriginal, Indigenous, and First Nations. So I did a little bit of research and I've put this link up into Blackboard as well for you. It's a really interesting website that defines lots of things. So find and use the correct terms, because I've found that when I'm working in Perth, and when I'm working in the Kimberley, and when I'm working in Queensland, that there are different definitions that people prefer when we're referring to our First Nations people. So if we have a look at that, we've got our Indigenous people is not always considered to be a positive one. And so we want to potentially refer to the actual group from their geographical or their language group. So for Perth, it might be our Noongar people and so on. So First Nations is used worldwide and it refers to those Indigenous peoples, and I'm finding that that's an emerging term in Australia. Now, Aborigine and Aboriginal and so on with no initial capitals, it means, yes, sometimes it's used quite derogatory. So you want to make sure that you are using the right frame and the right language for the right circumstances. So we've got yeah, I can't even say some of these because I just say them and I'm like, oh. So depending on the age group of people that you are talking with and the type of person that you are communicating with, there will be many, many things that will be said that you will cringe at. So what you want to make sure is that when you are communicating with anyone else, that you are the person holding the information and that you are using correct terminology. And if you are not sure, ask someone. Don't make assumptions. Ask your local community. So if you get a remote or rural placement, even as one of your pracs and so on, talk to people about the terms that you use and how you will define them as a collective group and so on. So what are people wanting to have as their names when you talk about them? Ask, please. You do not want to have people offside from the very beginning. So you're going to come in contact with our First Nations families, and you'll see them in lots of different places around. You will know they are part of our groups that you will have in nearly every single school. You will potentially not be able to see them by the way they look, because that's a common perception. People will turn around and say, oh, but they don't look whatever. Well, what does that mean? Don't please perpetuate a myth that people should look a certain way to identify with a certain culture. So you're going to come in contact with our First Nations people. So find out more about them. Find out what they identify as. Talk to the people in your school front office when you find out your prac placement and find out how many children are from different families and so on, from all the different cultures that they have. Don't say, oh, but I don't think I have any because nobody looks that way. That's not operating from a very well-informed point of view. So our traditional Aboriginal and First Nation families are a collection of clans that will have lots of different people in them. Watch the video, have a little chat about the kinship system, and they have a beautiful, wonderful idea of their extended family. And so that's when you will have different people that you will talk about in their families, and you need to understand that it's different sometimes to what you will have as your definitions. So those roles are set according to their positions in the family, and they'll live together in a communal environment and share responsibilities. So that means for you at the school that you might have different people coming to meet with you and so on. And we have some wonderful people who will be passing on the culture to the next generation and so on. So when we are working with our First Nations people, we have some general ideas. However, again, it's not like everyone's poured into a mold and going to behave and act in exactly the same way. So we will have sometimes children learn at an early age to judge their own capacity. That we will sometimes place the idea that children are not being disciplined. It's not that they're not being disciplined, they're being taught and encouraged in different ways. They have lots of independence. Young children are allowed to move away from the physical proximity to the parents. Whereas if you are in a park, you will have your other parents that will look condescendingly and, almost accusatory because their child is never more than a metre or so away from them. So the children are going to be accepting responsibility for each other. They're choosing the activities they want to participate in, and competition is not encouraged. So therefore, if that's part of their culture and they're coming into a school where the school's culture is very competitive, it's not going to work well. So children are taught the concept of shame, and they will feel that. They're taught to be very, very bonded to their kin. So having that lovely sense of belonging. And how does that all look to our non-Aboriginal and non-First Nations community members? Each one of those can be seen from quite a negative point of view. So helping everyone in the community to understand what's going on and why is really important. So we have had over time our stolen generation, so the loss of children from the families and communities that created this massive loss of identity, a massive loss of our spiritual and cultural heritage, and a massive disconnect with the land which they need. It resulted in a massive issue of loss of dignity and self-respect. We have issues in many of our Aboriginal communities with a lack of access to acceptable living standards. We know by lots of statistics that we have a high incidence of alcoholism and homelessness, and that can lead to abuse and issues that are happening with our children. We have increasingly sexually transmitted diseases amongst our families, particularly within the children, and we've got very poor general health of our children, which we know will impact on their long-term life chances. And we have an unfortunate disproportion of percentage of population versus percentage of children in institutions and prisons, and adults in prisons as well. And we know that we have some chronic homelessness. We've seen it all around us all the time. So what are the strategies that you are aware of? So think what you may have heard about and so on, and then think, what can we do at a school? So we've got our Aboriginal educational policy, we've got clear involvement of parents, we have an anti-harassment policy, you'll probably have a behaviour management policy, you'll have Aboriginal First Nation resources, you will have strategies in place at the school with regard to health issues, you'll have effective communication strategies hopefully, or you will start to develop them. And in a lot of our rural and remote schools, you'll also have Aboriginal assistants or your Aboriginal liaison officers. Now, things to be aware of. Sometimes for children, the fear of making a mistake is more threatening than doing the task itself, so they will hesitate. So therefore, how do you motivate the students? How do you provide lots of success for them? How do you make sure their curriculum is relevant? How do you build really good positive relationships? How do you build on prior knowledge? Create some nice structured materials, work in groups that are not competitive with other groups, constantly repeat things, and that's why you will find a lot of our schools up north in particular, they use the explicit direct instruction that relies on those structured materials and repetition. However, direct instruction does not allow for creativity and open-ended, so you need to create a better balance in your classrooms. And what we want to do in our schools is to make sure we incorporate the extended family as well. And of course, we make sure that we are considering cultural diversity in all its different forms. Our features of our teaching and learning. It's important, I think, that we don't put a huge distinguishing line down here. I think we need to earn the respect of all children, and that it doesn't matter the culture of the children. A lot of the things that are best practice, we just want to make sure that we put in place. So if we know that our First Nations children, they observe and imitate, therefore we want to make sure that we are facilitating that learning in different ways. That they are preferring to have personal trial and error using lots of concrete materials. We're building in problem solving and collaboration. We've got our real life activities. We're still building in sequencing and scaffolding. And we make sure there is some good teacher content and trying to have our teacher as the person who is helping them to direct themselves, but also being part of it conscientiously. So how do we develop these partnerships? So how do we involve our Aboriginal community? So we make sure that we're inviting parents to come in and share their stories and speak about things from their traditional activities. We're encouraging performances, but not just that. I don't want that to be the only thing that's ever done. We're making sure that we have appropriate guest speakers on things like our culture, our art and our craft. But again, don't just get somebody in to do dot paintings. That is so generalised and just so inappropriate. We're making sure that we have excursions to local galleries to view and appreciate Indigenous art that is relative to the location. We're doing nature walks, and you'll find that many local parks and many of our larger natural environment landmarks will have Aboriginal history, little plaques and so on. Kings Park has some fabulous ones. The zoo has some fabulous ones. There's a range of different ones that are available in different places that they will go through Aboriginal history as well. And where possible, you want to create more opportunities for the extended family to come along in some ways. Now, our remote communities, we know that Australia has some of the most remote communities in the world. So our governments place families in the town centres where population's higher, and therefore we don't need as many smaller and remote communities. But we do have lots of families still living in those remote communities. They have less opportunities for social interaction, there's less access to facilities, and they're often separated from their extended family members. But isolation's not always a barrier. So look at how you work with those cultural differences. You might end up in a town where you are the only person who looks like you. And so that gives you a really unique point of view for when a First Nations person comes down to an urban area and possibly in a classroom, they're the only person that looks like them. So it is an interesting role reversal that you may go through when you are up in a rural and remote community. So geographical isolation isn't always the barrier, but it can sometimes be a distance that is quite onerous to get to and move around. So when we look at things, we have always got teaching positions available in our Kimberley schools. So if this is a passion of yours, the Catholic Education Office always has this Kimberley Calling program where you are sponsored to go and work in these schools up north. So I know quite a few people go and do placements for prac in these areas. And then we also have lots of people who then get ongoing placements at these. There's always a high turnover in these types of places because they are challenging because of their distance and because of your isolation from your family members and so on. So that's why we always have openings for the for teachers up there, and we need to have good teachers so that they can really enhance the learning opportunities for our children. So if that is something you are interested in, just look up Kimberley Calling on the CEWA website and there'll always be the positions that are advertised for you. So again, this video I will pop into Blackboard as well, so you'll be able to watch that by yourself. And that's all about this idea of teaching in a rural and remote school and somebody giving their life experiences around it. And so our final slide. So next week, week 5 already, goodness, we are looking at social inequity, particularly when it applies to financial issues. And we're looking at changes in family structure, such as the impact of divorce and family death and so on, and how we can see those as barriers and how we would then be able to work with them and so on. So hopefully that has been informative, and we will have lots more discussions in our tutorials this week. Thanks everyone.